So I'm going to try to explain a little bit about what Bitcoin is, why it's important, and why we think it's going to grow drastically in the next 10 years. Um, so what is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is the first ever global transaction network. What does that mean? It means that it's open, quite literally it's open source, so anybody can go and download the code, review it, build on top of it. It's also open in the sense that since anybody can download it, that means that anybody can go and download this code and have a wallet for free just because they have a connection to the internet. It means that it's distributed. So there are computers all around the world, kind of like the internet, that work to maintain this global network and maintain this global ledger with the history of all transactions over time in this unified network. It's also secure. So how is all of this made possible? Bitcoin solved for the first time this very famous computer science problem called the Byzantine generals problem. In short, and what that means for Bitcoin, it means that any two people in this room can transact in a peer-to-peer nature. And if you think about all of the transactions you've done in your life to this point, that's never been true. Think about transferring, let's say, $100 from your Bank of America account to somebody else. You need Bank of America in the middle as a trusted intermediary to help you perform that transaction. That's what Bitcoin removes. It removes the need for this trusted third party. So in that example, you need Bank of America to go in and say, yes, debit $100 from account A and credit $100 to account B. And what are they doing? They're going in the background to their closed proprietary ledger of transactions and making a journal entry. So what does that mean for transactions as we go forward in the world? As a result, you can kind of think about Bitcoin like email for payments in a sense. It, by nature, is fast. It just takes a couple seconds for a transaction to confirm. It's cheap. Since you're just moving data around, it costs almost nothing to perform a transaction. And by nature, it's international. Again, much like the internet, it's borderless by nature because you're simply altering data. So I'm guessing that most people in this room have heard about Bitcoin sometime maybe in the last 2 years, at least in passing. It's grown quite substantially in the last 2 years. Depending on who you ask, there are between 5 and 10 million Bitcoin wallets worldwide. There are about 80,000 businesses that leverage Bitcoin in one way or another, and transaction volume on the network is growing rather rapidly. It's used in about 96 different countries, and quote unquote using it in a new country is pretty easy because you're just downloading some software. And there's anywhere between $50 and $500 million worth of value processed on the network each day, depending on the day. So let's put all of this into a bit of a global macro context for a second. So it costs about $500 billion a year to process payments, which, given the current state of technology, seems rather exorbitant. You think about what the internet did for the cost of distributing data, it kind of took it, made it open, and brought that cost down by roughly an order of magnitude. And we think that the same thing can happen here with value transfer, on top of the fact that you enable all sorts of new innovation. And you think about why that is, and it's due to the proprietary and kind of construction of these networks. So think about making a credit card transaction online as a simple example. By nature, in a credit card transaction, there are 4 people in the middle of that transaction. You have an issuing bank, a merchant bank, you have a network, i.e. Visa or MasterCard. Not only that, but you have this massive fraud cost, right? And we've all seen the identity theft piece of that, but the system is pretty fundamentally broken when you think about, as an online retailer, you're forced to be left holding the bag if somebody comes to you with a stolen credit card, despite the fact that you have no way of controlling the root of the problem. So 3% interchange, another 3% to fraud. You have all sorts of false declines because merchants don't want to be left holding the bag. And the all-in cost of the payment becomes very high. You think about rethinking this and having a system that was actually made for the internet, and the costs go dramatically down, it's free to accept Bitcoin, and to convert it to your local currency, it's probably less than 1%. I think one interesting trend in our lifetime has been the rise and fall of landlines, or maybe more appropriately, the plateau. So in our lifetime, we've seen landlines plateau at about 1 billion in the world, and it's slowly on the decline now. Meanwhile, we've had mobile phones and now smartphones rocket past that to about 5 or 6 billion, I believe, around the world. So what does that mean? You hear people oftentimes talk about the underbanked or the unbanked. What does it mean in that context? I think what you could very possibly see here is you now have 2.5 billion people that don't have a bank account in any way, but they rapidly are getting access to smartphones, to the internet. Is it plausible that their first bank account, their first store of value, is one that is free and electronic in nature? It actually seems quite plausible, and I think Bitcoin is a system that can enable that. In the scheme of things, Bitcoin is still relatively small in terms of transaction volume when you rank it against the major credit card networks. But it's getting close to some of the larger traditional remittance networks. And I bring up remittance because that is a classic example, in my opinion, of these closed networks where a company like Western Union, for example, can happen to move money across borders more easily than anybody in this room can as an individual, because they happen to just own a lot of global infrastructure, right? They can do it more efficiently than you can as an individual solely because of that fact. But again, these are closed networks. So what happens when we make these networks open, accessible to anybody? We allow anybody to go and build a business on top of it. As with any kind of efficient market, when you open things up, costs usually go dramatically down. Just anecdotally, we started by paying a developer back in Eastern Europe using one of these traditional networks. It cost us about 6% to do so, and that seemed exorbitant, so we started doing it in Bitcoin instead. And given we have the luxury of Bitcoin being fairly liquid in both the United States, so to the dollar, and in Europe to the euro, but that, now that we do it in Bitcoin, costs less than 2%. And I think these network effects will only be increased as more liquidity kind of pops up around the world over time. So I've spent a lot of time talking about the transactional in a dollar or in a fiat currency sense of Bitcoin. Another one, actually, quick show of hands, how many people here have spent in a single transaction less than 99 cents on the internet? You've done a purchase for less than $1. Okay, so a couple, but not a whole lot. And you have to ask yourself, well, why is that? And the answer is that the current payment rails, the networks, really don't support that in an economically efficient way. So for a credit card, there's usually a 15 or 20 cent base fee. That's 15 or 20% of your revenue just right out the door. In our opinion, Bitcoin will make small payments on the internet now viable. And if you look at where apps and mobile games are going, this will enable entirely new business models on the internet as a result. Going maybe more into the less transactional, but more, what does it mean now that we have a shared and distributed ledger of ownership in general? Think about securities clearing for a minute, so stocks and bonds. This is something that banks employ tens of thousands of people to do, and it takes 2 to 3 days often to settle a trade, and that seems crazy. Well, what happens when you put that on a network where everybody can see? It's very clear that ownership is transferred, and it's all taken care of by a unified network. Again, you can see how the costs go down dramatically, and you don't even necessarily need centralized places of exchange because you yourself can transfer ownership directly on the network. I'll try to keep this part brief. So we just simply make it easy to use Bitcoin. So an easy to use consumer wallet built on top of the Bitcoin network, much in the way that you have Gmail sitting on top of the email network. SMTP is the underlying protocol. We as a company sit on top of Bitcoin as the underlying network and kind of create this easy to use abstraction. We've got about 1.6 million consumers using that. We have a set of merchant tools that make it easy for businesses to use Bitcoin, and then a set of developer APIs so that all sorts of great ideas can flourish on top of Bitcoin. These are some of the people that we've started working with in 2014 to do that. Some of them, I think, are in the room today. The thing I want to leave you with though is think about this in many ways like the second coming of the internet, where the internet came along and brought the cost of distributing data down by an order of magnitude, and it made it open. It made data distribution free and accessible. The same thing is happening here, except it's not for data, it's for transferring value. Thanks for your time. I'm happy to. This tends to be a bit of a rabbit hole subject, so happy to talk with anybody afterwards. But thanks very much for your time today.
So let's go ahead and spend some time to discuss the topic at hand that could explain why Bitcoin has moved as fast as it has. Now, I understand, first and foremost, guys, you all know that there's a lot of noise in the cryptocurrency space. People, whether it be article websites in the crypto space, traditional media writing articles on crypto, and yes, even crypto YouTubers like myself can sometimes get a little bit caught up in the noise, or we'll point it towards some kind of catalyst in that case to give it a visual reason as to why Bitcoin is moving the way it is. But in today's video, I'm going to be talking about the things that I really try to push personally and say are the reason for crypto. And it's usually things that get underreported on and are very fundamental, not only in crypto markets, but every other market in the world. And that's simply supply and demand. If there's an excess of supply and little demand, prices decline. If there's a shortage in supply that's available to the market and there's a lot of demand, prices move up very quick. And the latter of those two scenarios, the one I just mentioned, is most likely what we're in right now. Now, how can we determine that? How is there any way we can measure that? Well, Bitcoin, being a public ledger blockchain and a simple accounting system of inputs and outputs, shows us that data in real time transparently. It's open to anyone. But many of us don't listen to it. Many of us don't look into it. So what can we look at in regards to Bitcoin's blockchain from the data that we're limited with? What can we determine? Well, there's something in regards to the base transaction model of Bitcoin and how it does its accounting, known as the unspent transactions, right? Or the UTXO model. This is how Bitcoin operates transactions. It's a game of inputs and outputs. For example, when Bob sends a transaction to Alice, he's using basically an original input from his wallet and now creating a new output to Alice's address. And in fact, he's probably creating two in this case. So you're spending some to Alice and you're also sending some to another address that you have the private key to. And that's how most wallets operate, at least to my understanding. So now that we understand the base kind of output model of Bitcoin, how can it help us determine the available supply to a certain degree in the Bitcoin market? Well, there's this really awesome chart here. We don't have to do too much data. Dhruv Bansal, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, and many people like him who work in data science and data analytics have done the work for us. I want to thank them for doing this because they've created a very awesome interactive and updated chart that shows us this data real time. And I'm going to explain what this is. I know a lot of you probably saw it at the thumbnail, and it might look a little bit overwhelming. It looks cool. I love the design, and it's very beautiful. I'm a data nerd myself, but I'm going to explain what this is. So this chart is made up of really two things. It's made up of a logarithmic black line that resembles Bitcoin's price over time. So we can see here at the bottom of the chart where the price started, and as you can see here, because it's logarithmic, the short dollar moves from a few cents all the way up to a few bucks look very dramatic. This was one of the first waves for Bitcoin, the second wave here, the third wave, and now it looks like we're shaping up for our fourth wave here over the next few years. And the other thing we have as well is the age bands, and these age bands determine the age of certain unspent transactions, or UXTOs, UXTOs in this case. So as we can see here, over time we see a growing band in the blue to greenish colors in regards to the chart. Now, what does this mean? Well, this means that we're having a lot of unspent transactions that have not been spent, right? Have not been exhausted on the network and used for over 5 years, right? So these funds have not moved for 5 years, a growing percentage of the supply. So to give you a good, grasp of this, if we take a look at the chart's data today, 20.5%, basically 1/5 of the entire Bitcoin supply of unspent outputs in this case have not moved for 5 years. That's very significant because back here at the previous peak, back here in around 2014, there was no way Bitcoin outputs could have not been spent for 5 years. Around 14% of the supply, or sorry, excuse me, 16%, as you can see here on the chart, 16.5% hadn't been spent over 3 to 5 years, right? So a very big difference in this case. And now if we were to take those two numbers into case, to be fair, that's around a little over 27% here that has not been spent, right? So a big difference in this case. A growing supply in each of these cycles is not moving. A lot of this could be due to the fact that people have lost their crypto. Some people are true hodlers and they're holding for the next few decades. And then along with that, it might be people who are cypherpunks who really agree with the Bitcoin movement and don't believe that they want to go into fiat currencies or sell their Bitcoin. Or it could be, again, in many cases, a lot of lost Bitcoin. And then we go down here and we can start to see there's different time bands. And the major point I want to drive here is that with each of these cycles, we're finding in the longer term trend that there are a lot of people who simply are just hodling Bitcoin. And we all know that's kind of the kind of social trend in Bitcoin is to obviously just hodl and not let the market sway you either way. You bought your Bitcoin, hold it for the long term. You'll be rewarded in the long term because this is the next evolution of money, right? Well, we can see here that with each cycle, we're seeing these kind of changes over time, the amount of Bitcoin that is moved within a certain period of time, the outputs. And if we take a look back here, for example, to the $4,000 mark, kind of when we were in the accumulation period for Bitcoin. I want you to take a look at the data here. We're going to scroll down a little bit and take a look at these percentages. So within a 12, the outputs that have been within a 12-month period, so the yellow line down to the red, we have a certain set of percentages. We have around roughly 12% that have not been moved within a 6 to 12-month period, 12% that have not been moved in 3 to 6 month period, and 8%, 6%, and 2.5 to 1.35 in this case. So it depends on really what kind of range you want to use in the sense of the age bands. But we can see that a smaller supply in this case had not been moving in a short period of time, in about 12 months. A growing supply of Bitcoin were not moved in a matter of 12 to 18 months, 18 to 24 months. In this case as well, we've also got 2 to 3 years, 3 to 5 years, and the ultimate mark of 5 years. So as more of this top range of the chart is growing, this means that the liquid supply of crypto is shrinking, right? It's shrinking in this case. And if we take a look at the previous cycle, it's the exact same case scenario. During this accumulation period, you were starting to have a squeeze here on the Bitcoin that was really circulating frequently. From all of these lower bands, you see a similar trend. And then eventually, we see a change, right? We see price starting to increase. You see buyers coming in, and you start to see more momentum of Bitcoin coming in and moving on the exchanges. And all of these you can see really outside of the 5 year and the 3 to 5 year. I mean, 3 to 5 year, kind of shrunk its market supply here. We really started to see these getting squeezed and starting to increase the momentum from the lower bands. So you see the most significant moves at the 3 to 6 month, the 1 to 3 month, and also the 1 week to 1 month and 1 day to 1 week, right? So in these accumulation periods, people are starting to pick up. So the thing to take away from this, if you guys want to read into the article, I recommend you check into it. I'll leave a link down below in the description. But again, the major point that I want to drive here is that over time, we are going to get to a very clear picture of the fact that Bitcoin itself has a very finite supply. And in this finite supply, there are going to be a lot of people who decide not to sell. They decide to hold long term. And that's going to shock markets sometimes. It's going to make us realize, a lot of us who probably don't look at this data and go, oh my gosh, okay, there's not much liquid Bitcoin available. A lot of us sold back here during these periods. These were really the last 2 periods that Bitcoin sold off here, when we had the 50% decline from 6,000 and the 60 to 70% decline from 20,000 down to 6,000 and 7,000. Okay, we need to get back in now. And it's not going to be a matter of, okay, we're going to buy and sell at the market price. No, buyers are clearing through the order book because the institutional buyers, the big, traders in this case, the smart money, are realizing that Bitcoin moves in very parabolic cycles. And they're not worrying if they're getting Bitcoin at 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000. They're buying it now and they're buying the ask price because they're trading for the longer term trend. They realize that there is a squeeze on the available Bitcoin. And the way to prove this, guys, I know a lot of people, I hear this all the time, guys, and I hate to say it, it's one of my most disappointing things I hear from you guys because I love you. I love you to death. There is manipulation in cryptocurrency markets, but what I don't like is when I see bulls and bears continuously saying, oh, the price is going up. This is pure market manipulation because you're short on the market or you're waiting to buy in. And then I see prices coming back down and the bulls are, oh my God, it's market manipulation. These whales, they're terrible people. I liked them when they bought the price, but I didn't like them when they sold it, right? And that's my major point here is that we've seen historically that Bitcoin has been able to move from the exact same starting point here as we did in December, back here in September of 2017. And in 13 weeks, we were able to make it up. In 91 days, we were able to make it a 558% increase. We've only moved up 258% over a 27-week period, guys. And even if you wanted to shrink it, to over here, for example, still 19 bars. It's taken longer to get less gains. This isn't market manipulation. This is buyers starting to accumulate, starting to realize that there is a shortage. There is a huge hodl culture in Bitcoin. Whether you're one of the early stage miners or you're an average everyday person who might have gotten in a year, 2 or 3 years ago, right? You want to hold on to your Bitcoin for the long term. That's the stigma in the culture. And I don't think that's, something wrong in this case. It's a hedge. Bitcoin is a growing store of value, very similar to gold in nature. But it's going to allow us to do a lot of interesting things that make it a better store of value outside of its core principles of having a finite supply. It's programmable money. We can do interesting things. We can transfer it internationally. So you already know. I think I don't have to tell you guys that kind of stuff. But I hope you get my point here, that we are, again, going to see faster and faster rallies. This is, I think, a big misconception that many people have had, including myself, that with larger markets, it's going to take longer periods of time to go up. And I really don't think that's the case, because as more retail participants come in, as more institutional clients come in, more ownership of Bitcoin is spread out across the world. And many people will be hesitant. Some will sell. Very true. And that's why we'll always have a liquid market. There's buyers and sellers on each side of the trade, which is why this isn't market manipulation. Because to make this kind of substantial move in the market with this kind of volume, we're returning back to the volume range that we saw back here in 2017, you would need excessive amounts of capital. And this is people making real long-term investments in Bitcoin. Some people also swing trading, but that means that they're not going to sell the Bitcoin until they get towards their long-term target range, whether that be more conservative like I have, around 40 to 60K, or 100K, or 500,000, or a million. It doesn't matter. They're probably not going to sell it until the cycle is clearly over, very similar to what we saw back here in December of 2017. All right.